Ursula Jackson never imagined that living in the cozy suburbs of Hamilton would become part of her story. It seemed that after all the night shifts, field operations, and dangers in army garrisons, the peace and quiet of the countryside would remain something alien to her. But here she is, sitting in a small car with 20-year-old Lila, her daughter, who barely listens to music in her headphones and holds a thin book on her lap. Almost all the way to their new home, the mother and daughter were silent, each thinking about their own future. After Ursula's aunt died of cancer, it turned out that the woman had bequeathed them a spacious estate on the periphery of Hamilton. Ursula couldn't refuse. In fact, it was her only close relative, albeit emotionally distant, and an incredible chance to start over. Her military service ended a few months ago, and she was struggling to find herself in civilian life. Lila, for her part, also needed stability. Her youth was spent moving around endlessly: army bases, other people's apartments, new schools. She learned to quickly join groups, but she always felt lonely. So there was hope that Hamilton could become their first real home. The new house was located away from the central part of the town, on a street with green lawns and well-kept fences. Although it was older than most of the neighboring houses, it looked surprisingly cozy. 2 stories of red brick, narrow windows, and wooden frames in good condition. The first time they opened the door and stepped inside, Ursula experienced a range of conflicting feelings. The furniture that had belonged to her aunt was still in place, giving the impression that the owner of the house had stepped out for a moment. A mixed smell of old tobacco smoke and some kind of herbal medicine was firmly rooted in the air, a reminder of my aunt's long treatment. "Mom, it's really spacious here," Lila said in a half-hearted voice, peering up the stairs to the second floor. "And a little creepy." "I know," Ursula agreed, running her hand over the old wallpaper. "But we have time, and we can make it work. I really want to believe that we came here for a reason." She noticed Lila's gaze shift outside, where a neatly trimmed garden was visible outside the window, and the sunlight shining through the spruce branches seemed to create a picturesque idyll. Ursula sighed. Once upon a time, she had only dreamed of everyday peace without risking being in the midst of danger every day. And now perhaps she had a chance to taste peaceful civilian life for the first time. The first few days were spent trying to sort through her belongings and put the big house in order. Ursula dusted off a layer of dust, sorted through the documents left by her aunt, and Leela wandered slowly from one room to another, deciding where best to put her music set and desk. The town turned out to be surprisingly hospitable. Neighbors greeted her with nods and smiles from afar, and one day a woman passing by asked if they needed help with their furniture. Such open friendliness confused Ursula a bit at first, as she suspected a hidden agenda. However, she tried to convince herself that perhaps everything was really simpler and kinder than she was used to thinking. Every night, when Lila fell asleep, Ursula would stay in her chair, staring at the photos from her military past. In the photos, she was in uniform, alongside her comrades in arms and friends. One photo shows the moment of awarding after a particularly risky operation. She recalled the feelings that were rushing through her blood when her confident decisions saved someone's life. And now everything seems to be over. Now she has to become an ordinary civilian woman and a caring mother. Perhaps this house will give her the strength to learn to live in a peaceful environment without the usual adrenaline. Lila did not know how to tell her mother about her own experiences. She could see that Ursula was also worried, so she didn't want to add to the trouble. But sometimes she would walk into town to do some shopping and was surprised at how friendly the people were. Next to the bus stop, there was a small church with a snow-white facade and bright stained glass windows that seemed to invite her in. "Come in. You are always welcome here." Lila even stopped several times and read the announcements about youth gatherings and musicians' performances. Thus, the first week was spent in endless cleaning and small household chores. Both Ursula and Leela gradually got used to the idea that this was probably going to be a long time. Deep down, Ursula was glad that she no longer had to rush off to some training or respond to alarms. Now she had to learn to listen to her own heart, and it was still difficult. One morning when the sun was shining brightly on the porch, Ursula and her daughter decided to take a closer look at the surrounding streets. On the main road, they saw several shops, a coffee shop, and a majestic Gothic-style church decorated with colorful stained glass windows. When they stopped at the gate to look at the facade, a friendly, middle-aged man in a black jacket with a light scarf approached them. "Hello," he said. "I see you've just moved in," he said with a gentle smile. "I'm Randall Matthews, the pastor of this church. It is a pleasure to welcome you to our community." Leela looked at him curiously, but also feeling a little nervous because churches had not been her favorite place growing up. Her family often took her there on vacation, and she had different memories from then on. However, there was something about this man's posture that inspired trust. "Good afternoon," Ursula replied politely and shook his hand. "We just moved into the neighborhood. My name is Ursula Jackson, and this is my daughter Lila. Nice to meet you." The pastor nodded in a friendly manner, immediately telling them that the church often hosts youth meetings, concerts, and charity projects, and inviting them to join in. "You will make friends here. This town is really very friendly, believe me." Ursula was grateful for the kindness, but deep down she remained wary. Her years of military danger preparedness had become a natural behavioral style for her, and so she was in no hurry to trust the people she had just met. And yet, there was something about the pastor's manner of communication that made her feel like she was meeting a truly sincere and decent person. On the same Sunday, Leela decided to attend a youth meeting at the local church. Once there, she felt a warm, relaxed atmosphere. They talked about music, traveling, exchanged jokes, and even did funny skits with biblical stories. Randall was also present. He made several casual jokes, and when he noticed Leela, he came over and asked her if she was enjoying herself. She admitted, a little shyly, that this format was new to her. "If you ever need some wise advice or just need someone to listen," he said with a friendly smile, "don't hesitate to ask. I understand how difficult it is when you have just settled in a new place, especially at your age." These words sounded quite reassuring to Lila, and she was grateful that someone here noticed and understood her internal anxieties. At the same time, she felt a little uneasy for a moment as she caught the pastor looking at her a little longer than he should have. However, he immediately regained his usual gentleness, remaining as friendly and far from any ill intent. Meanwhile, Ursula stayed at home, fixing minor repairs and going through the old receipts left by her aunt, making sure she and Lila had enough money to keep the house running. Sometimes she remembered that her daughter had gone to church, and she thought that she was unlikely to ever join the congregation herself. The Army's discipline and precision were enough for her. But if such activity helps Lila with her socialization, then let her. The following weeks brought new changes. Lila started coming to church more often, either for a music rehearsal, or for charity events, or for youth gatherings. This pleasantly surprised Ursula, for she was glad that her daughter was finding peers and things to do. But at times she was still confused. She felt that Leela spoke too enthusiastically about Pastor Randall, as if he were her mentor or even her father. When her mother asked, "Well, what do you think of him? Is he a normal person?" Leela answered sparingly and without specifics. It seemed to be an idyllic environment, but Ursula, whose military instincts were well hardened, occasionally picked up small signals that disturbed her. It seemed to her that this friendly environment was too homogeneous. The same tone of voice, excessive praise of the town, the belief that bad things just don't happen here. Ursula tried to appreciate all this hospitality in a kind way, but deep down, she was troubled by her deep-rooted military wariness. After years of suspicion mode becoming part of her character, she was in no hurry to open up and believe in the sincerity of strangers. However, the pastor's manner of speech seemed so natural and pleasant that she involuntarily assumed that he might be a genuinely good man with no ulterior motives. A few weeks passed, and Lila became more and more involved in church activities. She liked the fact that she was appreciated for her empathy and ability to be sensitive. There was an open atmosphere at youth meetings, and she saw it as a place where she could easily make friends. She was especially surprised to receive attention from Randall, the pastor, who began to show a strong interest in her. One day after a youth meeting, Lily had to clean up the hall alone. When everyone had left, Randall came to her under the general pretext of making sure everything was okay and offered her a ride home, as it was getting dark. Leela agreed. Both the late hour and the distance made walking not the best option. In the car, the pastor asked her about her habits, hobbies, and life aspirations. At first, Leela thought it was just friendly interest, but the tone of his voice was so soft that she unwittingly revealed too much to him, told him about moving around and about not having any stable friends. "Did you miss your father's figure?" Randall asked as an afterthought when he pulled the car over in front of their house. "Yeah, I guess," Leela shrugged. "I was all about my mom, and I hardly knew my dad." The pastor replied that he himself had grown up without a father, and since childhood he had lacked a role model. He confidently added that he understood that feeling of emptiness. These words suddenly struck the girl, making her feel as if they had something in common. A few days later, when Leela was helping out at the church again, Randall invited her to his office, where he stored the items and donations for charity to sort everything. There, amidst the messy boxes, the pastor again brought up the subject of her past, this time with even more trust. He took her hand, listening sympathetically to the painful episodes in her life. His voice sounded so relaxing that Leela did not immediately notice how the boundaries were blurring. He reinforced her confidence by looking her in the eye and repeating that she was special and worthy of love. At first, the girl felt only gratitude and warmth, because she really needed that support. But gradually she noticed that his touches were getting longer, and his gaze was not so much fatherly as it was blushing. Nevertheless, she suppressed her anxiety, not wanting to ruin this benign friendship for herself. But the real nature of the pastor was far from innocent. It turned out that this was not the first time he had used the trust of young women in this way, knowing how to skillfully play on their vulnerability and religious beliefs. His methods seemed to be well honed, starting with compliments and creating an atmosphere of safety, pretending to be a caring father, and then gradually imposing dependence. Leela didn't notice how she started to worry when she thought of him. He seemed to her like a kind of savior, a figure she consciously dreamed of, especially since Ursula was always busy. In the evening, when Leela was late for church choir practice, Randall offered her a ride. On the way, he suggested stopping at a roadside cafe for coffee. Sitting at a small table across from the pastor, she felt uncomfortable because they had to discuss rather personal things. Randall asked her delicately about her first relationship and the guy she had dated. Lily seemed genuinely interested, and she told him more than she had planned. When it was dark outside, he suddenly touched her shoulder, ran his hand through her hair, and said, "You are special. I can't stop thinking about you." She was taken aback, as if she didn't know how to react. "But we just," she started to say, but Randall interrupted. "I know it's weird, too. Me being a pastor, you. But isn't it possible that God brought us together to help each other? Don't you feel that connection?" These words filled Leela with mixed feelings, from gratitude and satisfaction to shame and excitement. She wanted to run away, but at the same time she was happy to receive such unusual attention. She only nodded slightly for lack of better words. This episode seems to have been the starting point of their secret affair, which was both forbidden and magnetically attractive. Returning home that night, Lila was deep in thought about whether she was doing the right thing. No one had ever complimented her so much or hugged her with such tenderness. Could this be true love? Or, as Randall used to say, God's will? However, resistance grew inside her. She felt that she was crossing a dangerous line. If Ursula finds out, there will be a big scandal, she reasoned, especially since he is a pastor and the age difference is obvious. But at the same time, she was drawn into this world, where he claimed that their relationship was blessed from above and not at all sinful. Leela did not realize that she was trapped in a relationship that was not a gift from heaven. Meanwhile, Ursula, although she noticed that her daughter was returning much later, did not suspect anything was wrong. To her, this seemed like the usual activity of a teenager who was finally discovering social life, not asking for extra money or quarreling unnecessarily. On the contrary, Lila seemed calmer and more balanced, which only comforted Ursula. She was happy that her daughter had found a social circle in something to do, not realizing that behind the facade of these meetings and help at church was something else entirely. In fact, Randall had long been using a tried-and-true strategy to get closer by playing on inner emptiness, religious beliefs, and the search for a mentor. He forgave himself for this as a weakness, and he made Lily believe that she had seduced him. The seemingly idyllic atmosphere of the town, the friendly parishioners, and the hospitable church were only a cover for his cunning plans. Several months had passed since Leela had felt his special interest. It all started with concern and talk about the girl's potential, but each time they went further and further. Barely noticeable gestures grew into close embraces, followed by kisses, and eventually the night came when they became intimate. For the first time, Leela did not understand whether this was a manifestation of sincere love, manipulation, or something even worse. Mixed feelings of shame, fear, and curiosity struggled within her, and the pastor only added fuel to the fire, convincing her that there is no sin here and that higher powers want them to be united. Leela was growing more and more distant from Ursula. Her mother noticed that her daughter was locking herself in her room more and more often, getting lost in her own thoughts and reacting irritably to her mother's usual questions about her studies or everyday life. It seemed that their former connection had broken down. Ursula explained this as a typical youthful rebellion and decided that such a stage always occurs when a child aspires to become an adult. Meanwhile, Lila suddenly developed alarming symptoms: morning sickness, constant exhaustion for no apparent reason. At first, she thought it was the stress of her secret meetings with Pastor Randall and the fear of being found out. However, when the unpleasant feelings only intensified, she decided to take tests at a local clinic under anonymity. And what she heard there, "You're pregnant, congratulations," almost caused her to faint. Really, from the pastor? How can this be? Panicked thoughts ran through her head. Leela realized that she had no idea how to tell Ursula, and how would Randall himself, who had a family and a reputation, react? The next day, she decided to tell the pastor. He agreed to meet her at church to discuss it face to face. As soon as she said in a trembling voice, "I'm pregnant," Randall's expression changed instantly. His usual calmness disappeared, and fear and rage appeared in his eyes. "Couldn't you have taken care of yourself?" he said harshly, showing no sympathy at all. "I thought you were, well, that you were wearing it," Lila began, embarrassed. She had no experience with contraception, and she trusted his words that God protects everything. She didn't know how it usually works. "Listen to me," he said, squeezing her hand. "You have to have an abortion, okay? This has to be covered up. I will not let my life be ruined because of your stupidity." "But," she tried to argue, her heart pounding like crazy. "No buts," he cut her off in an icy tone. "I have a family, a community, obligations. You're the one who ruined everything. Make sure you get rid of this child, and no one can find out about it." Lila almost burst into tears. She realized that she had been shamelessly used, and now she was being blamed for everything. But in her heart, she still hoped that he was truly worried about her. So she asked him again quietly, "What if I can't have an abortion? Are you crazy?" His voice broke through with unheard of anger. "I'll take every measure to destroy you. I'll say that you provoked me, that it was you." He viciously used several insulting words against her. "The church will believe me anyway. They will leave you alone to blame." Hearing Pastor Randall's harsh words, Leela suddenly realized that he would do anything to protect his reputation, and that he would not hesitate to threaten and humiliate her. Her chilling fear made her run out of the office, barely holding back her tears, and the pastor himself did not even seem to be going to calm her down. The girl was left alone with this burden. She had to choose between having a secret abortion or revealing everything to her mother and provoking a scandal. When Lila returned home, she was even more depressed. Ursula immediately noticed that her daughter was in tears and nervous, but she just brushed her off, grumbling, "I'm fine, Mom. Don't touch me." The aggression that began to break through in her voice confused Ursula, but she still hoped that it was just a teenage whim. Meanwhile, Lila's condition was getting worse every day. Morning nausea, confusion, panicked thoughts about the future in the evening. All of this was turning her life into a nightmare. It was incredibly difficult to decide to have an abortion. On the one hand, this child came from someone who had humiliated and used her, but on the other hand, it was still her own blood. Eventually, she began secretly looking for clinics and opportunities for the procedure. There was no support nearby. One day, Ursula overheard Lila's phone conversation discussing urgent options as she passed the door. Hearing the words abortion, the mother was petrified. Where did this come from? After all, her daughter hadn't mentioned any relationships. The situation seemed more than strange. Then Ursula decided to ask a frank question. Leela, seeing her persistence, was frightened to reveal the terrible truth. She was pregnant by Pastor Randall, who had literally forced her to get rid of the child. Ursula remained standing there as if dug in. Images from her wartime past flashed before her eyes, and she couldn't understand how she could ever allow such danger to be near her daughter. And when Lila added that the pastor had threatened to defame and destroy her, Ursula felt as if something had exploded inside her. Anger overcame her in seconds. How dare he? I'm his... I... Ursula's voice trembled with hatred. She remembered all those times in the service when she had to instantly eliminate a threat. Seeing this, Lila felt genuinely frightened. Her mother had never looked so determined, with her back stretched like a string and her eyes full of rage. Her daughter began to plead, "Mom, don't do anything stupid. There are other ways." But Ursula, not listening, was already climbing the stairs to get the weapons she always kept for emergencies. Her maternal feelings merged into unrestrained aggression against Lila's abuser. Thanks to her military experience, Ursula realized that her presence and threats could stun the pastor and force him to stop the pressure. However, she also felt that her hot blood and habit of acting decisively, as well as her skills with weapons, could have consequences far more dire than just scaring him. As Ursula angrily walked through the house in search of the weapon, she thought back to all the warning signs she had ignored. Randall's overly gentle friendliness, his boundless authority among the parishioners, the strange hints he made in conversations with Leela, the late hours she returned from church. Now everything was falling into place. He had trapped his daughter, forced her to confide in him, and distorted her trust and feelings. Eventually, Ursula found the metal box where she had hidden the gun. She touched it as if in a flashback to the wartime, when her heart was pounding and she had to act without hesitation. Lila begged her mother to stop, grabbing her hands, frightened, not wanting her to go to church in such a furious rage. But Ursula said in a low voice, "I'll just scare him. Otherwise, he won't realize what he's done." But she knew very well that in military affairs, when you face the enemy, things can get out of hand. There was still time to stop, perhaps to call the police. However, Ursula did not want to drag her daughter into courts and interrogations, did not want her to be accused and harassed. She thought that she could handle it herself because she was both a mother and a warrior. An image from the past came to mind. When during one mission she was responsible for a group of young soldiers, and she acted in cold blood, leaving the enemy no chance. Now she saw the pastor as the same enemy who threatened her child's future. Leela, on the other hand, was torn between a sense of relief that her mother would come to her defense and horror at the possible consequences. Frightened, she described in more detail how the pastor pressured her, demanded an abortion, called her names, and humiliated her. In response, Ursula clenched her teeth, not hiding her rage. This was the final push. In the evening, when Lila fell asleep in tears in her room, Ursula disassembled the gun on the table, examined every part, checked the ammunition. It all reminded her of pre-deployment preparations for a combat mission. Perhaps she already realized internally that with the gun in her belt, their conversation with the pastor would hardly be limited to intimidation. Meanwhile, the town was quiet as usual. Residents were waiting for the Sunday service, confident that everything was in order. Randall himself probably had no idea that Leela could have confessed to her mother, so he calmly believed that he had the situation under control. Ursula hardly closed her eyes that night. The memories of the battle came back to her in the form of harsh images, mixed with the image of the meeting with the pastor. I kept hearing in my head, "I'm not going to kill him, I'm just going to make him stop." But somewhere deep inside I was aware of this. You know how to use a gun, which means things can go too far. At dawn, she looked at her daughter. Lila looked exhausted, but she kept begging her mother not to take any harsh steps. Ursula quietly put her hand on her daughter's hair and whispered barely audibly, "Daughter, I have to. I won't let this scoundrel ruin your life." Lila watched her mother leave the house in silence. She thought about calling the police. Mom with a gun is planning something terrible. However, she was paralyzed by fear. What if the situation only gets worse? The pastor would find a way to control everything again, and she was helpless, too exhausted to act. As Ursula sped through the evening city in her old SUV, her thoughts revolved around the fact that today would be the day. Although Hamilton had seemed friendly, she now saw it as another battlefield. Once her enemies had been criminal elements or military opponents far away, but now they were a clergyman who skillfully hid his deeds behind religious rhetoric. As Ursula parked outside the church, she realized that it was getting quite dark. The weak streetlights cast yellow glare on the old walls. Getting out of the car, she put the pistol in her jacket pocket, her heart fluttering as if she were stepping into enemy territory. The building's lights were on, coming from the pastor's office. It looked like he had stayed late, perhaps preparing a sermon or flipping through documents. Inside, it was empty and quiet. The corridors were in semi-darkness, with only a flickering lantern barely illuminating a room. It was eerie. Moving almost silently, she reached the door of the office and stopped for a moment, an anxious lump clenching in her chest. It's now or never, she thought. As she opened the door, Ursula noticed Randall sitting over his papers, his head up. "Ms. Jackson?" he said, surprised. "What are you doing here so late?" Without another word, Ursula stepped inside and closed the door behind her. The pastor immediately noticed the intensity in her eyes and her slightly rapid breathing. "I know what you've been doing," she said quietly. She seemed to be speaking in a casual tone, but every word had a dangerous meaning. "You dragged my child into these disgusting activities, forced her, got her pregnant, and now you're insisting on an abortion? Do you really think I'll forgive you?" The pastor flinched, then tried to regain his composure. "You must have been told too much. Lila herself," he began. "Don't you dare mention her name." Ursula interrupted him harshly, taking another step closer. "Stop lying." Randall sucked in a breath, as if he was preparing to attack in a verbal duel. "You have no idea who you're dealing with. I have a lot of influence in this community. If you're planning to intimidate or blackmail me, you're wrong. No one will believe you. The whole town will come to my defense because I am—" He didn't get a chance to finish, because Ursula had already pulled out her gun, pointing it directly at him. Her gaze combined unbearable anger and deep pain. The pastor immediately fell silent. Obviously, he had not expected this. "Now you're going to listen to me," she said, holding the gun with obvious firmness. "You're going to admit your guilt, get out of this town, and not try to hurt Lily anymore. Do you understand? Don't you ever go near her again." Randall swallowed dryly, but suddenly a sly smile flashed across his face. He seemed to doubt whether she was even capable of firing. "You think you're a superhero?" he wheezed, standing up slowly. "You're a former military officer. You should know how to control your emotions. Instead, you're acting like a crazy person with a gun. It's obvious that your nerves are getting the better of you." Ursula clenched her jaw tensely, feeling a dangerous wave of indignation rising inside her. She was outraged that this man showed no remorse and continued to speak with disgusting arrogance. "Listen," she said, trying to keep her voice in a calm range. "I don't want you dead, but you have to admit what you did and leave my daughter alone." "Admit?" The pastor twitched his lips, looking closer at the muzzle of the gun. "You have no idea how things work here. I have the power to punish you both. The locals will take my side, and I'll tell them that your Lila came to me like a whore. You don't seem to have realized yet that I am the omnipotent one here." These words completely threw Ursula off balance. It was as if she had a flashback to those tough operations when she faced ruthless enemies. She remembered Lila's tears and the humiliation she had suffered. The word whore in her daughter's direction was the last straw. She took a step forward and aimed directly at the pastor's chest. He staggered back, a defiant grimace on his face. "Hey, stay back!" he shouted. "You're not going to shoot, are you? You're a military man. You have some limits, right?" And in that moment, something clicked in Ursula's head. All the principles shrunk to one single one: protect your child. Her fingers gripped the handle even tighter. The pastor rushed toward her, perhaps trying to knock the weapon away or immobilize her. In the chaotic struggle, he again spewed venomous insults. "You're both worthless!" There was a loud shot. One shot, but it drowned out everything around. The walls of the building echoed. Randall staggered, dropping what he was holding. A red stain immediately appeared on his white shirt and grew rapidly. "No!" came out of his mouth as if he couldn't understand what had happened. His eyes were frozen with confusion and disbelief. In a matter of moments, he fell to the floor. Ursula stood motionless with her weapon, as if numb. The world around her suddenly disappeared, leaving only her and the body of this hypocrite writhing in agony. Her fingers opened unwillingly, and the gun fell to the carpet. Her breathing became ragged, and her ears were ringing. As a former military officer, she had seen death many times before, but she had never had to kill in civilian life, let alone within the walls of a church, where a different order usually prevails. "What have I done?" she wondered. However, the thought immediately resurrected. "I saved my daughter. There was no other way out." The pastor hardly moved, losing blood. He looked up only once, as if he wanted to say something, but Ursula did not listen. She realized that this was the end, and there was no turning back. In the empty church, only the echo of that single shot could be heard. Ursula froze over Pastor Randall's motionless body, feeling her heart pounding. It was as if she had returned to a military operation, where she had to act instantly and at the limit of her abilities. But this was not a war. It was a quiet Hamilton, and in the middle of a pool of blood, on the floor of a church, a local spiritual director was lying on the floor. In the first seconds after the shot, Ursula just stood there, not knowing what to do. Her mind was filled with images of Leela, the pastor's defiant shouts, her own anger, and the sudden realization that everything was now changed forever. Sirens sounded in the distance, though she wasn't sure if they were real or echoing in her head. Eventually, she realized that she had to call the police herself to report the fatal shot, so she dialed 911. She whispered when the operator asked for the nature of the call. "I just killed a man in a church building." This short confession triggered an immediate response. The dispatcher asked her to keep talking and found out the coordinates. Ursula automatically gave the address and left the phone next to her, no longer able to speak. Meanwhile, the pastor was lying there without any signs of life, blood slowly spreading on the wooden floor, creating a gruesome picture. Within minutes, a sheriff's car arrived, followed by police and an ambulance. Blue and red lights flashed in the darkness, and neighbors could be heard running out of their houses, staring at the police officers in confusion. At that moment, Ursula was still in the pastor's office, standing with a blank stare at the desk. When the police came in, she silently raised her hands, her gun lying on the floor to the side. "Don't move!" came the command. Without resisting, Ursula allowed herself to be handcuffed. No one had any idea what had happened. One of the police officers quickly examined the pastor, realizing that he was already dead. One of the officers pulled out a camera or turned on a body camera, recording every detail of the scene. "You are under arrest on suspicion of murder," they said, leading Ursula down the hall to a police car. A group of parishioners had already gathered in the courtyard in front of the church. Several of them recognized Ursula. "This is the same woman who recently moved into our neighborhood. What has she done?" Their voices sounded shocked, with a touch of indignation. Someone exclaimed, "She killed the pastor." "Maybe she's crazy." Ursula looked away, realizing that it was useless to justify herself now. In a short time, the incident spread across the local media. A former soldier shot a well-known pastor right in his church. The motives remain unclear. That evening, the story caused a great deal of reaction. Some people immediately called Ursula a terrible monster, while others tried to understand what exactly drove her to do such a thing. At the same time, the first interrogation began at the police station. Ursula seemed to maintain an outwardly calm demeanor, although a storm was raging inside. Answering the officer's questions, she was reserved. "Yes, I shot. He hurt my daughter. I'm sorry, but I had no choice." She avoided disclosing details about the pregnancy and the coercion, realizing that it could cause a loud scandal and even more attention. However, she realized that it was impossible to hide everything for long, and sooner or later, the police would come to the full truth. While all this was unfolding, Leela was in her own home, worried. She had already guessed that her mother had gone to meet with the pastor, seeking to resolve the issue by force, and when the news came from the neighbors that something tragic had happened in the church, she felt as if the ground was slipping from under her feet. Later, police officers knocked on the door to inform her. Ursula had been arrested on the suspicion of murder. Leela burst into tears because all her fears had come true. Her mother had lost her temper and done the impossible. That evening, investigators began to question Lila about the details. At first, she remained silent, worried that she might be accused as well. But soon, realizing that the truth would have to be revealed, she shared the story of her affair with the pastor, her pregnancy, and the threats and humiliation he had inflicted on her. This moved the police. A clergyman whom they considered a model for the city was involved in a shameful scandal. Some of the police officers were suspicious, asking if Lila was making things up to justify her mother's actions. But the calls, phone messages, and doctor's notes confirmed her words. The official investigation was launched. Experts examined the crime scene, the bullet, and the direction of the shot, which showed that everything had happened almost at close range. It was clear that the pastor was apparently trying to take the weapon away or fight. At the same time, cautious remarks began to emerge from members of the congregation, hinting that Randall's life was not so perfect, but no one dared to speak out. But it was the news of Leela's pregnancy that caused the biggest stir. Local newspapers ran catchy headlines like, "Loud Scandal. Did a pastor force a minor to get rid of a child? A former military officer punished her daughter's abuser." The community was divided. Some desperately defended the pastor's memory, treating everything as slander, while others supported Lila and expressed outrage that he used his status to manipulate young parishioners. Meanwhile, Ursula unequivocally admitted that she had pulled the trigger, but insisted that she was defending her daughter's honor and safety. With her bluntness, she told the investigators, "I knew what I was doing. There was no other way to stop this monster. But it is up to the court to decide whether they will show her compassion." In addition, while investigators were reviewing all the evidence, the community in Hamilton had to put up with an atmosphere of unrest. Black ribbons were hung on the church building in memory of the deceased pastor. Parishioners organized prayer meetings to mourn their lost leader and curse the brutal killer. But at the same time, in some conversations, people began to speculate. Maybe the pastor was not as holy as everyone thought. Soon enough, the police gathered evidence to bring the case to court. Ursula was charged with second-degree murder, but the prosecutor's office hinted that the charge could change to a more serious one, depending on the facts. Although she did not deny her crime, there was still a chance that her lawyer would base her defense on affect and protecting the child from the abuser. The scandal only gained momentum. The media sought to find out whether Pastor Randall was just a one-time offender or whether his behavior was marked by systematic abuse. Vague stories emerged about the excessive attention the pastor paid to other young female parishioners. However, there was a lack of evidence, and everything remained in the realm of conjecture. For most of the people of Hamilton, this came as a deep shock. Their pious clergyman turned out to be a man far from holy. While Ursula remained in custody, awaiting the start of the court hearing, she was appointed a public defender. At the same time, given the incredible hype surrounding the case, several experienced lawyers volunteered to help her. They saw the potential to turn this trial into a high-profile precedent, emphasizing that she was not a callous murderer, but rather a mother who lost control of herself under severe moral shock. After the interrogations, Lila was haunted by a sense of guilt because she confessed too late. On the one hand, she wanted her mother not to go to extremes, but on the other hand, she was relieved that everything was out in the open, and the pastor would no longer be able to threaten her. However, the price for this turned out to be painfully high. It took several months to prepare the trial. Prosecutors gathered evidence that it was a premeditated murder. They interviewed witnesses, checked whether the church's surveillance camera was functioning, which unfortunately was not working that night. They emphasized that Ursula, being a former military officer, should have understood the danger of her actions with weapons. Ursula's defense was based on facts that proved crimes on the part of Pastor Randall: sexual coercion, threats, manipulation. The idea was that, under severe emotional distress, Ursula had no intention of committing murder, but was simply protecting her daughter. They were going to appeal in court to the fact that no mother could indifferently watch her child being turned into a toy and threatened with her destruction. When the trial finally started, the courtroom was packed to capacity. The press, townspeople, believers, Ursula and Lila's friends, all wanted to witness the outcome of the scandal that had completely divided the town. The prosecutor was the first to speak. In his speech, he emphasized that Ursula deliberately came to the church with a weapon and ruthlessly killed the helpless pastor. The prosecutor mentioned the fact that Lila was pregnant in passing, considering it a minor fact, and emphasizing that it in no way gave him the right to organize a lynching. Then Ursula's lawyer took the floor, outlining the opposite story. Imagine you are a mother who finds out that a respected spiritual leader raped your daughter and forced her to have an abortion, generously spicing it up with threats. Coupled with the post-traumatic stress syndrome that our client suffers from, she instantly lost control. Lena's testimony was listened to in absolute silence. She told in detail about the pastor's advances, how he got her to consent, how he oppressed her and told her to get rid of the pregnancy, accompanying it all with insults. Muffled sighs rolled through the room as she described his behavior. The prosecutor tried to shift the blame, saying why the girl hadn't gone to the police in advance, but Lila, breaking down in tears, claimed that she was afraid of publicity and persecution from the pastor himself. Several parishioners were also called to testify, recalling that they had noticed a somewhat unhealthy interest in young people, but that no one had taken it seriously before. This is how the other side of Randall's image was formed, far from his saintly role and closer to a skillful manipulator. But the decisive factor in this case was Ursula's military experience. The prosecutor kept emphasizing, this is not just a person prone to an outburst of anger. She is a former military officer who has been training for years to control herself even in extremely difficult situations. Instead, she could have gone to the police or used legal methods to protect her child. However, she decided to take a gun and commit a lynching. The defense tried to show that the psychological breakdown was due to a combination of combat trauma and the sudden realization that her daughter had been abused. Several psychologists who were summoned to the court argued, Ursula suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder, which increased the likelihood of an impulsive reaction. After 2 weeks of intense hearings, the jury retired to deliberate. Everyone in Hamilton was holding their breath. Part of the community sympathized with Ursula and hoped for a lenient sentence, while others demanded exemplary punishment, arguing that no circumstances justify murder, even if the pastor was a scoundrel. When the verdict was announced, a wave of muffled shouts swept through the courtroom. Guilty of murder was the official wording, the judge taking into account certain mitigating aspects, including the violence against Lila, post-traumatic stress disorder, and the pastor's attack on Ursula's person, but not forgetting her military training, handed down the following sentence: 15 years in prison. Ursula listened to this, petrified inside. She understood how long this sentence was, and that such a punishment meant the loss of a huge part of her life. However, somewhere in her heart, she realized that she had saved Lila, and this was a relief. She accepted the verdict, fighting back tears. Lila was present in the courtroom, and when she heard 15 years, she felt sick, almost fainted. Self-accusations ran through her mind. If I had confessed earlier, if I had done something different. But as we know, history does not give a second chance. Immediately after the trial, Ursula was taken to a prison van in handcuffs. One of the neighbors exclaimed, "This is our new resident. Why did she kill the pastor?" While others whispered, "A brave mother," though she crossed the line. So the city found itself in the midst of contradictory assessments, and it was clear that the split in society would only get worse. Once behind bars, Ursula had to get used to the life of a prison. For a person who had spent half her life wearing a uniform and obeying orders, the new conditions were a shock. She felt the burden of her actions all the time. Every day was accompanied by rigid rituals, cold looks from the guards, and most importantly, internal pain. The old battle nightmares were compounded by the images of that fateful night in the church. She saw herself pulling the trigger again and again, the sound of a gunshot cutting through the silence, the pastor falling. These scenes were repeated so often that they sometimes drove her to silent sobs in the dark corner of her cell. Working behind bars in various small units, such as the prison canteen or the library, Ursula tried to distract herself from her depressing thoughts. Observing her, the guards saw that she did not look like an ordinary prisoner, but despite this, she had to follow the general rules. Sometimes conflicts broke out with other inmates when they provoked her or made fun of her past, but for the most part she kept to herself. The most difficult were the meetings with the prison psychologist. At each session, they talked about her feelings of guilt, her war trauma, and how an impulsive outburst of emotion led to the fatal shot. The specialist explained that the effect could have appeared against the background of post-traumatic stress and shock at what had happened to her daughter. Ursula did not deny it, only repeated it with pain. I could have acted differently, but there was no time to think. Her psyche was in a deep mode of self-blame. Left behind with her wounds, Lila also found herself virtually alone. She had lost her mother, the one who, despite all her faults, had always been there to keep her safe. Now they were separated by a prison fence, and the pastor who had ruined her life was no longer alive. Some of the neighbors remained convinced that she had seduced the preacher herself, while others sympathized, realizing that Lila had fallen victim to a cunning manipulator. Due to public condemnation and moral pressure, the girl left the local college, unable to continue her studies. On top of that, a psychological crisis exacerbated by stress led to a miscarriage. And although she had previously doubted whether she should keep the child, now the pain of the loss was too strong in her soul. It seemed that she was left completely alone with her multifaceted, "Why did everything turn out this way?" The therapist tried to explain to Lila that the pastor was the real culprit and that Ursula, despite her wrongdoing, only wanted to protect her. However, the girl's mind was filled with holes of guilt and pain. She thought that if she had told her mother earlier, the current tragedy could have been avoided. However, the feeling of guilt will not turn back the clock. Instead, life went on in the town, but the feeling of a heavy legacy did not disappear. A new pastor was appointed in the church, but discussions about the previous one did not subside. Some wanted to remember him positively, claiming that he had done a lot of good, while others preferred the truth. He crippled a young life, and this was confirmed by the court. The community remained divided as some sympathized with Ursula and Lily, while others saw them as troublemakers. A year has passed since Ursula was imprisoned. In her new place, she spent time in the prison library, sometimes picking up war memoirs and even a Bible. She was allowed to write letters, and this opportunity eased her inner pain. At first, she sent short, excited letters to Lila, full of apologies and mentioning that she did not mean to take away the child's mother. Lila would cry when she received these letters, but she would reply to them because she realized that they had a bond that no amount of imprisonment could destroy. Gradually, a letter contact was established between mother and daughter, in which they seemed to be learning to hear each other again. Ursula admitted in her letters that she regretted that she did not have time to officially denounce the pastor back then, did not go to the police. Lila responded with letters describing her changes. She resumed her studies at another college in a neighboring town, seeking to build a future from scratch. Occasionally, she would visit her mother in prison, enduring the humiliating inspection procedures. During these brief encounters, they were seated on either side of a plastic table. Ursula would occasionally touch her daughter's fingers, trying to ask for forgiveness. Lila sighed. "Mom, I didn't want you to do time like this. But I guess it would not have been otherwise." They sometimes burst into tears and then laughed sporadically, recalling those long-ago days when life did not seem so dark. The rumors and discussions of this tragic story gradually lost their sharpness in the local community. People found new topics to gossip about, although the sad shadow of past events still hovered over the town. And for Lila, it all remained an open wound. She tried to find a job, tried to move on with her life, but changed therapists several times. Each one emphasized that surviving sexual abuse and the loss of her mother was a difficult journey that took time and gradual healing. A few years later, Lila was already helping other young girls who had been victims of similar stories, even though she had not yet fully recovered. She convinced them that silence could lead to even worse consequences. She gave speeches to university groups on how to recognize manipulation and where to go for help. Ursula, serving her 15-year sentence, could potentially apply for parole, but this issue has not yet been resolved. In the meantime, she tried to behave impeccably. She stayed out of fights, attended rehabilitation groups for veterans, where she began to talk more honestly about PTSD and the burden of her actions. Her mind seemed to be trying to find a fragile inner reconciliation. Ursula did not justify herself, but she was learning to forgive herself for not considering other options and for acting in accordance with her combat code, neutralize the threat. Some of her former neighbors kept in touch with her in fragments, sharing news from Hamilton. They said that after Randall's death, people elected a new pastor who was more open in his dealings and relations with the parish. It seems that this terrible event made many people look at the town more soberly and abandon the illusion of its perfection. Thus, slowly, the story of Ursula and Lila became a reminder that silence, violence, and insincerity sometimes push people to the extreme. Some in the community still remembered Pastor Randall as the poor victim of an aggressive woman in uniform, but there were also those who, having been moved by Lila's story, saw him as a villain. After all, no one justified the lynching, but it was also impossible to avoid punishment for the pastor's sins. Lila continued to visit her mother every few months, bringing books, sometimes her own drawings or photos of her college life. Ursula watched with sadness, but also with joy, as Lila began to live again. Although she would probably have to deal with the post-traumatic effects for a long time. She's young, she has everything ahead of her, Ursula thought, trying to smile through the bars. Once, during a meeting, Lila said, "Mom, you saved me, even though you took a terrible step. But I want you to know that I don't blame you. I just regret that it all unfolded the way it did." Ursula hugged her daughter gently, as much as the prison rules allowed, and for the first time in a long time felt tears of relief. She realized that although the punishment could not be avoided, their love had not disappeared. Meanwhile, the estate in the Hamilton suburbs they had once inherited was now empty. Lila had moved closer to college in another city, and Ursula was still serving her sentence. For the neighbors, this story became less and less of a topic of conversation because it was too painful a reminder of how imperfect the perfect-looking town could be. However, some did not forget. The most sacred place can hide a monster, and the most tormented soul can take a desperate step for the sake of love. Several years passed. Lila has grown up, graduated from college in another city, and works for an organization that cares for victims of violence. She has not yet fully healed her emotional wounds, but she is gradually moving forward. She sends Ursula letters over and over again, telling her about her successes and obstacles. Ursula, who is serving a 15-year sentence, has received some leniency for good behavior. Her days are spent between duties in the prison library and attending psychotherapy, where she is slowly learning to talk about PTSD and the pain of her fatal choices. She is now more aware that events could have turned out differently and recognizes that by stopping the threat, she also destroyed her own life. From time to time, old friends write to her to tell her that things have changed in Hamilton. A new pastor has appeared, more open and honest. Perhaps the shock of that tragedy forced the community to look at their city differently and get rid of the illusion of paradise serenity. As if to warn others, the story of Ursula and Lila reminds us how silence and treachery can be pushed to the extreme. While some still consider Pastor Randall to be the victim of an armed lunatic, others recognize that the murder cannot be justified, but it was also inappropriate to let his crimes go unchallenged. Every few months, Lila visits her mother, bringing books, sometimes her drawings or photos from her new circle of friends. Ursula receives this news with sadness, but also with joyful relief, noticing that her daughter has not broken down, even if she has to fight for her own future for a long time. She's young and has a chance to realize herself, Ursula thinks, smiling through the prison bars. And one day, when Lila carefully says, "You saved me, and I don't judge," her mother, though chained to her cell, feels a small flash of pride. She is still a mother who has not been broken even by war, even though her own rage has taken away her will. It is this thought that helps Ursula hold on as she looks at the stone walls and remembers that one day she will be able to cross them, greeting a new dawn in freedom.